I remember the cold silence that filled my New York apartment the moment I realized my daughter and her CEO had both turned their backs on me. It was the kind of silence that screams betrayal louder than any shout could. The trust one had built over decades crumbled in a single moment. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 73 years old, I thought I understood what family meant. Every morning, I wake to the distant hum of the city outside my window on the Upper West Side, the honk of taxis weaving through Broadway, the murmur of hurried footsteps on concrete, the rumble of the subway beneath my feet. But inside my one-bedroom apartment, my world has become quieter than a library at midnight. I shuffle through faded family photos scattered on my worn coffee table, each one a dagger wrapped in nostalgia. There's Sarah at her Columbia graduation, cap tilted slightly to the left, her smile brighter than the Times Square billboards. Another shows her blowing out 25 candles, chocolate cake smeared on her chin, laughter frozen in time. But these memories sting more than they soothe now, like pressing on a fresh bruise. The apartment feels smaller each day, its beige walls closing in like a gentle prison. My hands, weathered from decades of hard work, trace the edges of picture frames that once brought me joy. The radiator hisses its familiar winter song, but even that comforting sound can't warm the chill that has settled in my bones. Last Tuesday morning, while sipping my usual black coffee from the chipped mug Sarah gave me for Mother's Day 15 years ago, I gathered the courage to send her a text. My arthritic fingers moved slowly across the phone screen, each letter a small victory against the pain in my joints. Sarah, honey, I need help with my medical bills this month. The insurance didn't cover everything, and I'm worried. Send. Hours passed. The little notification never came. No dots showing she was typing. No heart emoji. Nothing but the crushing weight of silence. 2 days later, I tried calling her office. The receptionist's voice was crisp and professional. Brookstone Financial, how may I help you? I asked for Sarah Mitchell, my daughter, and was put on hold. The elevator music felt like mockery, cheerful notes dancing while my heart sank deeper. I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson, but Ms. Mitchell is in meetings all day. Can I take a message? Another wall. Another door closing in my face. That's when I remembered James Brookstone, the CEO himself. I'd met him several times at family dinners when Sarah first started working at his company. He'd sat at my modest dining table, complimented my pot roast, called me Mom Pat, with that charming smile that reminded me of my late husband. He'd seemed genuinely interested in my stories about growing up in Queens, about raising Sarah as a single mother after Robert left us. I found his direct number in my old address book, the pages yellowed with age. My heart hammered as I dialed, hope and desperation battling in my chest. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. James Brookstone speaking. Mr. Brookstone, it's Margaret Patterson, Sarah's mother. I hope you remember me. A pause. Too long. Oh, yes, Margaret. Of course. How are you? The warmth was gone from his voice, replaced by the kind of polite distance you use with strangers. I explained about my medical situation, about needed surgery for my knee that had been bothering me for months, about the insurance complications. I wasn't asking for charity, I was asking for help from family, or so I thought. I'll see what I can do, he said, but his tone told me everything. Empty words. Hollow promises. The kind of response you give when you have no intention of following through. That phone call ended with a dial tone that echoed through my apartment like the last note of a funeral dirge. I set the phone down with trembling hands and stared at the framed photo of Sarah and James at the company Christmas party last year, both of them smiling, champagne glasses raised in celebration of something I wasn't part of. The cancelled invitations had started months ago. Sarah's birthday dinner became too complicated with work schedules. The family 4th of July barbecue was postponed indefinitely. Thanksgiving was suddenly just going to be small this year, which apparently meant I wasn't invited to the dinner I'd hosted for 27 consecutive years. Each rejection felt like a paper cut, small, sharp, and cumulative. 1 might be understandable. 2 could be coincidence. But a pattern? That was intentional cruelty disguised as circumstance. I began to wonder if I had imagined the warmth, the connection, the sense of being needed and loved. Had I been living in a fantasy while they built walls around me, brick by careful brick? The realization crept in slowly, like fog rolling off the Hudson River on a gray morning. I wasn't family to them anymore. I was an inconvenience. A reminder of obligations they'd rather forget. A name on a contact list they scrolled past without stopping. For 47 years, I poured my life into raising Sarah in our small apartment in Astoria, Queens. The walls were thin, the neighbors loud, but it was ours. Every dollar I earned scrubbing floors in Manhattan office buildings after midnight went toward her future. Every sacrifice was an investment in her dreams. I remember those first years after Robert left. Sarah was only 8, and the questions came like arrows. Why doesn't Daddy live here anymore? When is he coming back? Did I do something wrong? Each question tore pieces from my heart, but I held strong. I had to be both parents, both the foundation and the shelter. The overtime shifts at the cleaning company became my second home. From 11 at night until 6 in the morning, I would mop hallways in the financial district, empty trash cans in law offices, dust desks where important decisions were made by people who would never see me coming or going. I was invisible to them, but I was everything to Sarah. I skipped doctor appointments to pay for her violin lessons. When the school said she had potential for Columbia if she could afford the prep courses, I worked Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve, every holiday that offered double pay. My body ached, my back screamed in protest, but her future was worth every pain. "Mom, you don't need to do this," she'd say when I handed her another envelope of cash for textbooks or class fees. But I couldn't stop. How could I explain that providing for her was the only thing that made sense in a world that had taken her father away from us? How could I tell her that watching her succeed was the only medicine for my broken heart? The night before she left for Columbia, I found a note on my pillow. "Thanks for everything, Mom. I promise I'll make you proud." That piece of paper, written in her careful handwriting, became my most treasured possession. I kept it in my wallet, pulling it out during the hardest moments as proof that the sacrifices meant something. But slowly, subtly, things began to change. The weekly phone calls became monthly. The monthly visits became holiday obligations. The holiday obligations became excuses about being too busy, too tired, too overwhelmed with work. I told myself it was natural. She was building a career, finding her place in the world. The financial district that I had cleaned in the shadows was now her domain in the daylight. She wore expensive suits where I had worn rubber gloves. She made deals in boardrooms where I had emptied wastebaskets. When she landed the job at Brookstone Financial, I was so proud I could hardly contain myself. I called my sister in New Jersey, my few remaining friends from the old neighborhood, anyone who would listen. "My Sarah is working for one of the biggest investment firms in the city," I'd say, my voice swelling with pride. James Brookstone himself had recruited her from a smaller firm, recognizing her talent with numbers, her ability to read market trends like I used to read bedtime stories. He invited both of us to dinner at an expensive restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place where I'd never eaten, where the silverware was heavier than my entire set at home. "Your daughter is exceptional," he told me that night, cutting into his steak with precise movements. "She has instincts that can't be taught. She'll go far with us." I beamed like the sun itself lived in my chest. This successful man, this pillar of the financial world, was praising my daughter. All those years of sacrifice suddenly felt validated, worthwhile, meaningful. "She gets it from you," he said, raising his wine glass toward me. "The determination, the work ethic. You should be proud of what you've built." Those words sustained me for months. When my arthritis flared and I could barely open jar lids, I remembered his respect for my sacrifices. When the loneliness crept in during long winter evenings, I held on to his recognition of my role in Sarah's success. But recognition and respect, I learned, are not the same as care and support. My birthdays began to disappear from their calendars like erased entries. 71 came and went with a brief text message: "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry we can't make it over. Crazy week at work." 72 was acknowledged with a generic card that arrived 3 days late, clearly grabbed from a drugstore display during a hurried lunch break. This past January, when I turned 73, nothing. No call, no text, no card. I sat in my kitchen eating a cupcake I'd bought for myself at the corner bodega, the single candle casting shadows on the empty chairs around my table. The Cuban family upstairs was celebrating something, laughter and music filtered through the ceiling, reminding me of what joy sounded like in a home filled with love. When February brought news that I needed knee surgery, the weight of isolation became unbearable. My doctor, a kind Pakistani woman who'd been treating me for years, explained that the procedure wasn't covered entirely by Medicare. The gap would cost nearly $4,000, more than I had in my savings account after helping Sarah with her security deposit on a new apartment the previous year. "Do you have family who can help?" Dr. Patel asked, her eyes compassionate behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Yes," I said automatically, because saying no would make the truth too real. "My daughter works in finance. She'll help." But when I asked, the help never came. Not from Sarah, who claimed her money was tied up in investments. Not from James, who seemed to develop selective amnesia about our family dinners and his promises to look out for me. The surgery was postponed. My knee worsened. Walking became an exercise in managed pain, each step a reminder of how alone I truly was. The city that had been my home for decades began to feel hostile, its pace too fast for my hobbling gait, its noise too loud for my aching head. Winter in New York can be brutal when you're healthy and loved. When you're neither, it becomes a daily test of survival. My heating bills climbed while my bank account dwindled. I wore layers of sweaters inside, kept the thermostat low, rationed warmth like a precious commodity. One particularly vicious February evening, when the wind off the river cut through the city like broken glass, I called Sarah again. My persistence felt pathetic even to me, but desperation has no pride. I really need help, honey, I said when she finally answered on the fourth ring. My knee is getting worse, and I can't afford, Mom, we're in the middle of dinner. Can this wait? Dinner. While I was eating canned soup and wondering if I could make my medication last another week, she was having dinner too important to interrupt. It's just that the pain is constant now, and Dr. Patel says if I wait much longer, I'll call you tomorrow, she said, and the line went dead. Tomorrow never came. Or rather, it came and went without a phone call, just like the day after that, and the day after that. That's when the shocking discovery happened, the moment that changed everything and revealed just how naive I'd been about my own situation. It was a Tuesday in March, unseasonably warm for the season. I had decided to surprise Sarah with lunch at her office, something I'd never done before. My knee was having a good day, and I thought maybe a face-to-face conversation would bridge the growing distance between us. Brookstone Financial occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower near Wall Street. The lobby was all marble and steel, designed to intimidate and impress. I felt small in my worn wool coat, clutching my old purse like a shield. Security required me to sign in, wait for approval, accept a visitor's badge that felt like a mark of my outsider status. After 20 minutes, I was escorted to the 15th floor, where Sarah worked in an open area filled with monitors displaying endless streams of numbers. She looked up from her desk with surprise that quickly shifted to embarrassment. Mom? What are you doing here? Before I could answer, I heard voices from the conference room nearby. The door was slightly ajar, and James Brookstone's distinctive baritone carried clearly into the hallway. The Patterson portfolio continues to exceed expectations, he was saying. The initial investment of $200,000 has grown to nearly $700,000 in the past 18 months. Margaret Patterson may not understand the complexities of what we're doing, but her portfolio performance is keeping our quarterly numbers solid. My breath caught in my throat. Margaret Patterson, that was me. But what portfolio? What investment? I had never invested $200,000 with anyone. I barely had $2,000 in my entire savings account. She's completely unaware of the growth, another voice added, a voice I didn't recognize. As far as she knows, she just signed some routine paperwork when Sarah started working here. The power of attorney Sarah secured makes this seamless. Power of attorney. The words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered signing papers when Sarah started at Brookstone, documents she'd said were standard employee family forms, nothing important. Just routine stuff, Mom. Insurance beneficiaries, emergency contacts. But it hadn't been routine. Somehow, without my knowledge or understanding, they had gained control of money that belonged to me. Money I didn't even know existed. My hands began to shake as the pieces fell into place. The reason James had been so interested in me, so charming at those family dinners. The reason he'd recruited Sarah so aggressively. The reason they'd both become distant when I started asking for help with my medical bills. They had my money. Money I didn't know I had, being managed without my knowledge, growing into a fortune that could have solved every financial worry I'd faced. And while I rationed soup and postponed surgery, they were celebrating the success of my portfolio at company meetings where I was discussed like a financial instrument rather than a human being. I backed away from the conference room on unsteady legs, my visitor badge suddenly feeling like evidence of trespassing. Sarah looked up again, concern creasing her forehead. Mom, are you okay? You look pale. How do you confront your own child about betrayal so complete it rewrites your understanding of reality? How do you ask why the people you love most have been lying to you while profiting from your ignorance? I'm fine, I managed to say. I just remembered I have an appointment. The elevator ride down felt like falling through space. The marble lobby blurred through tears I couldn't hold back. Outside, the March air felt like freedom compared to the suffocating realization of what had just happened. I walked for blocks without direction, my knee screaming in protest, my mind racing through implications I couldn't fully grasp. Somewhere in the maze of paperwork I'd signed to help Sarah, I had apparently become a victim of my own trust. That night, I sat on my kitchen floor and let the tears fall without sound. The linoleum was cold against my legs, the overhead light harsh and unforgiving. A porcelain teacup slipped from my trembling hands and shattered on the floor, pieces scattering like fragments of my broken trust. I thought of saying no for the first time in my life. The word felt foreign, dangerous, like speaking a language I'd never learned. Fear wrapped around me like the New York chill that always found ways through my apartment's old windows. The fear of being completely alone, of losing what little connection remained with the only family I had. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. A flicker of anger so pure it felt cleansing. I deserved better than this. I deserved honesty, respect, acknowledgement of my worth beyond what I could provide financially. I spent that night packing away photo albums into cardboard boxes, each image a reminder of love I'd given freely and trust I'd offered without condition. In my bedroom mirror, cracked from a fall the previous winter, I stared at my reflection and saw something I hadn't noticed in years. I saw a woman worth fighting for. The next morning, I called the number Dr. Patel had given me for a social worker who helped seniors navigate complex financial situations. Eleanor Martinez arrived at my apartment 2 days later, carrying a briefcase and an attitude that suggested no one was going to take advantage of me on her watch. "Tell me everything," she said, settling into my kitchen chair like she belonged there. "Start from the beginning." For the first time in months, someone listened. Really listened. Eleanor took notes, asked questions, explained concepts I'd never encountered. Words like fiduciary responsibility, elder financial abuse, and guardianship fraud entered my vocabulary like legal weapons I hadn't known I could wield. "Mrs. Patterson," she said after reviewing the papers I'd retrieved from my files, "you may have options here. But first, we need to understand exactly what was done with your money and whether it was done legally." The investigation took weeks. Eleanor worked with a lawyer who specialized in elder financial abuse, a woman named Patricia Chen whose small office in Chinatown became my sanctuary of hope. They requested documents, filed forms, made phone calls that gradually painted a picture of my financial situation that was both better and worse than I'd imagined. The good news was shocking: I was worth nearly $800,000. Money that had come from the sale of a small property in Queens that my mother had left me years ago, money I'd forgotten about, money that had been invested without my knowledge through the power of attorney Sarah had obtained. The bad news was equally shocking: I had been deliberately kept ignorant of my own wealth while being made to feel dependent on others' charity. My own daughter and her employer had been managing my money, profiting from their management fees, while I struggled to pay for basic necessities. "This is unconscionable," Patricia said during one of our meetings, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They've been treating you like an ATM that doesn't know its own balance." But confronting them would not be simple or safe. Eleanor explained that financial abuse within families often escalates when victims try to reclaim control. "You need to be prepared for their reactions," she warned. "They're going to fight this, probably claim it was all above board, maybe even suggest you're not competent to manage your own affairs." The thought terrified me, but not as much as the prospect of continuing to live as their unknowing victim. Confronting Sarah wasn't something I could do over the phone or through text messages that she might ignore. This required presence, weight, the kind of gravity that only comes from looking someone in the eye and demanding truth. I chose a Wednesday evening in late April, when the city was softening into spring and hope felt possible again. I took the subway to her apartment in the Upper East Side, a building I'd helped her afford with what I'd thought was my last savings, but which I now knew was a fraction of money that had always been mine. The doorman recognized me and waved me through without calling upstairs, a kindness that felt both familiar and strange. In the elevator, I practiced what I would say, but no words felt adequate for the betrayal I'd uncovered. Sarah answered her door in yoga clothes, wine glass in hand, classical music playing softly in the background. Her apartment was beautiful: hardwood floors, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, furniture that cost more than I'd made in entire years of night cleaning. "Mom, what a surprise. I was just relaxing after work." She stepped aside to let me in, but her smile seemed forced, defensive. "We need to talk," I said, remaining standing in her foyer, afraid that sitting would make me seem less serious, less determined. "Of course. Is everything okay? You seem upset." "Where do you begin when everything is wrong? How do you compress a lifetime of trust into a conversation about betrayal?" "I know about the money," I said simply. Her face went very still. The wine glass paused halfway to her lips. "What money?" "My money. The portfolio. The investments. The power of attorney you had me sign." She set the wine glass down carefully on a side table, buying time while her mind worked. "Mom, you're confused. We've talked about this. You signed standard family paperwork when I started at Brookstone. $800,000, Sarah. That's how confused I am. The number hit her like a slap. She sat down heavily on her expensive sofa, looking suddenly much younger than her 35 years. Who told you that? She asked quietly. Does it matter? What matters is that it's true, and you've been lying to me about it while I begged you for help with medical bills. While I rationed soup and wore 3 sweaters to keep my heating bill down. It's not that simple, Mom. The money was just sitting there earning nothing. We've tripled its value for you. You should be thanking us, not attacking us. Thanking them. For stealing my autonomy. For making me feel helpless while I was actually financially secure. For treating me like a child who couldn't handle her own affairs. I should be thanking you for letting me postpone surgery while my money paid for your lifestyle? That's not fair. Her voice rose, defensive and sharp. Everything we did was legal. We made you money. We've been protecting your interests. By keeping me in the dark? By making me feel like a burden while you celebrated my portfolio's success in boardroom meetings. She stood up then, pacing to her window, looking out at the park I'd taken her to as a child, where I'd pushed her on swings and taught her to ride a bicycle. Now she looked at that view from her expensive apartment, paid for with money that had always been mine. You wouldn't have understood the investments, she said without turning around. You would have been scared, wanted to keep everything in savings accounts earning nothing. We did what was best for you. What was best for me. Not what I wanted. Not what I chose. What they decided was best for someone they considered too simple to understand her own money. I'm 73 years old, I said. I raised you alone. I worked my entire life. I've made thousands of decisions, and somehow I managed to accumulate enough money that you felt comfortable stealing it. But I'm too stupid to manage my own affairs. Mom, please don't be dramatic. We didn't steal anything. Then why didn't you tell me about it? Why let me struggle when I had money to solve my problems? Why ignore my calls for help when you knew I could afford the surgery? She turned from the window then, and I saw something in her face I'd never seen before, not shame, not guilt, but irritation. Annoyance that I had discovered their deception. Frustration that I was making this complicated. Because if you knew about the money, you would have spent it, she said. You would have given it away to everyone with a sob story. You would have bought things you don't need. You're not good with money, Mom. You never have been. Not good with money. The woman who had raised her on a cleaning woman's salary, who had managed to save enough to help her through college, who had somehow accumulated $800,000 without even knowing it, was not good with money. Get out, she said quietly. What? I said get out. If you can't trust us to manage your affairs better than you can, if you can't appreciate what we've done for you, then get out. I had come to her apartment hoping for an apology, for acknowledgement of wrongdoing, for some recognition that I deserved honesty. Instead, I was being punished for discovering the truth. The elevator ride down felt different than it had 30 minutes earlier. The same elevator, the same brass buttons, the same soft ding at each floor. But I was different. The woman who had entered her building was still partly a victim, still partly hoping for reconciliation. The woman who left was someone else entirely. Outside, the April evening was warm enough that I didn't need my coat. I walked through Central Park as darkness fell, past couples holding hands and families with children who ran ahead on paths lit by old-fashioned lampposts. The city continued its eternal rhythm around me, indifferent to my personal revolution. I called James Brookstone the next morning. Margaret, I was hoping to hear from you, he said, his voice carrying that practiced warmth I now recognized as calculated. Sarah mentioned you had some concerns about your portfolio. I'd be happy to walk you through the numbers. I want to transfer my account to another firm, I said without preamble. A pause. I think that would be a mistake. We've done very well for you. Your returns have been exceptional. Returns that I knew nothing about while you listened to me ask for help with medical bills. Those were separate issues. We couldn't just liquidate investments every time you had an expense. That's not how wealth management works. Wealth management. As if my financial security was their responsibility to manage rather than mine to control. Mr. Brookstone, I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you of my decision. I'll have my new financial advisor contact you about the transfer. Margaret, please don't make any rash decisions. Sarah is worried about you. We both are. Family financial matters can be complicated, and sometimes emotions get in the way of good judgment. There it was, the suggestion that I was too emotional, too unstable to make rational decisions about my own money. The implication that their deception had been for my own good. My judgment is fine, I said. Fine enough to recognize when I'm being manipulated. I hung up before he could respond, my hands shaking not from fear this time, but from the adrenaline of standing up for myself. The next few weeks brought a campaign of pressure that would have impressed a political operative. Sarah called daily, leaving voicemails that escalated from concerned to frustrated to angry. James sent flowers with cards expressing his hope for reconciliation. Other employees from Brookstone, people I'd never met, sent letters explaining how much they'd appreciated working with my account. "Mom, you're making a huge mistake," Sarah said when she finally caught me on the phone. "Do you know how hard it is to find returns like you've been getting? Do you understand that most firms would charge you twice what we've been charging me?" Another revelation: not only had they been managing my money without my knowledge, they'd been paying themselves for the privilege. "What you've been charging me for services I never requested with money I didn't know I had. You signed the paperwork, Mom. It's all legal." Legal. The refuge of people who know their actions are wrong but technically permissible. Patricia Chen had warned me that family financial abuse cases often became battles of narrative. "They'll claim you're confused, incompetent, ungrateful," she'd said. "They'll make you the villain for wanting control of your own money." The prediction proved accurate. Within days, I learned that Sarah had been telling people I was having some kind of breakdown, that I was paranoid and suspicious for no reason, that she was worried about my mental state. The character assassination hurt more than the financial deception. To steal my money was one thing, but to then portray my desire to reclaim it as evidence of mental decline felt like a second betrayal, deeper and more personal than the first. My few remaining friends began calling with carefully worded inquiries about my health. "Sarah mentioned you've been having a hard time lately," they would say. "Is there anything we can do to help?" The isolation was crushing. Not only had I lost my daughter and the man I'd considered family, but now my reputation was being systematically destroyed to justify their actions. That's when Emma appeared in my life like an answered prayer I hadn't known how to pray. Emma Rodriguez lived in the apartment next to mine, a woman in her 30s who worked as a social worker for the city. We'd exchanged pleasantries in the hallway, smiled at each other in the laundry room, but had never had a real conversation. She knocked on my door one evening in May, carrying a container of homemade soup and an expression of genuine concern. "Mrs. Patterson, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem like you've been having a hard time lately. I made too much soup, and I was wondering if you'd like some company while we eat it." The kindness was so unexpected, so pure, that I nearly cried right there in my doorway. When was the last time someone had offered me company with no agenda, no hidden motive, no expectation of what I could provide in return? We sat in my kitchen sharing her delicious vegetable soup while I found myself telling her everything. About Sarah, about the money, about feeling like a stranger in my own life. Emma listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and expressed the outrage I'd been afraid to feel. "They stole from you," she said simply. "Not technically, maybe, but morally. They absolutely stole from you, and then they made you feel crazy for being upset about it." Her validation felt like sunlight after months of shadow. Someone believed me. Someone else could see the wrongness of what had happened. I wasn't losing my mind or being ungrateful. I was being victimized, and I had every right to be angry. "What are you going to do?" Emma asked. That night, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. I was going to take my first step toward real independence, toward living life on my own terms instead of in the shadows of other people's expectations. The next morning, I called Sarah and left a voicemail. "I'm taking a step back from our relationship while I figure out my finances. Don't call me for a while. When I'm ready to talk, I'll call you." Then I called Patricia Chen and told her to proceed with transferring my account to the independent financial advisor she'd recommended, a woman named Ruth Goldman who specialized in working with seniors who wanted to maintain control of their own affairs rather than ceding it to family members. The first meeting with Ruth took place in her office in Greenwich Village, a cozy space filled with plants and family photos that felt warm rather than intimidating. Ruth was about my age, silver-haired and direct, with the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of making her own decisions. "Tell me what you want," she said after we'd reviewed my financial situation. What did I want? The question caught me off guard. For so long, the question had been what everyone else wanted from me. What Sarah needed. What James expected. What would be best for the portfolio. But what did I want? "I want to understand my own money," I said slowly. "I want to make my own choices about how it's invested and when it's spent. I want to be able to pay for my surgery without asking anyone's permission." "Those are reasonable goals," Ruth said, smiling. "More than reasonable. They're your rights." Working with Ruth felt like discovering a language I'd always been meant to speak. She explained concepts without condescension, asked my opinion on investments, respected my conservative instincts while helping me understand options I'd never considered. Most importantly, she never made me feel stupid for not knowing things I'd never been taught. When I apologized for asking basic questions, she stopped me firmly. Margaret, there's no shame in learning. The shame is on people who kept you ignorant to serve their own purposes. My knee surgery was scheduled for early June. For the first time in months, I could afford it without worry, without begging, without feeling like a burden. I was using my own money to take care of my own health, and the freedom felt intoxicating. The night before the surgery, Emma came over with dinner and stayed to keep me company. We watched old movies on my television, sharing popcorn and talking about everything except the drama that had consumed my life for the past few months. "You seem different," she said during a commercial break. Calmer, but also stronger. She was right. Something fundamental had shifted inside me. The desperate, anxious woman who had begged for help had been replaced by someone who understood her own worth and power. The surgery went well. My recovery was smooth. And for the first time in my adult life, I was taking care of myself with resources I controlled, decisions I made, plans I chose. But Sarah and James weren't done with me yet. 2 weeks after my surgery, as I was healing and beginning to walk without pain for the first time in years, Sarah called. She was crying, not the angry tears of our recent conversations, but the soft, desperate tears that had always been able to break down my defenses. "Mom, I'm sorry," she said. "I know we handled things badly. I know you feel hurt. But we're family. We need to work this out." Family. The word that had always been my weakness, my vulnerability, my reason for accepting the unacceptable. "I miss you," she continued. "James misses having you at family dinners. We made mistakes, but we can fix them. Can't we try again?" The old Margaret would have melted at those words. Would have apologized for being difficult, would have minimized her own hurt to preserve the relationship, would have accepted crumbs of affection as proof of love. But the new Margaret had learned something crucial: love without respect is manipulation. Affection without honesty is performance. Family without trust is just obligation. "Sarah, if you're truly sorry, you'll respect my decision to manage my own finances. You'll acknowledge that keeping me in the dark was wrong, regardless of your good intentions." "I do acknowledge that. We should have told you about the money. But Mom, you have to understand our position too. We were protecting you." Protecting me. The same justification, repackaged with tears and apologies but unchanged in its fundamental arrogance. "I'm 73 years old," I said quietly. "I don't need protection from my own money. I need honesty from my family. Can we have dinner next week? Just the two of us? We can work this out." I wanted to say yes. Every instinct trained by decades of putting family first urged me to accept, to compromise, to rebuild the bridge. But I had learned that some bridges lead to places you don't want to go. "I need more time," I said. "And I need to see changes, not just promises." The call ended with mutual expressions of love that felt hollow, like ritual words without meaning. 3 days later, the final test of my transformation arrived in a form I never could have expected. I was walking home from the grocery store, my knee strong and pain-free, carrying a bag of fresh vegetables and feeling proud of my independence, when I ran into Mrs. Chen from the building. She lived on the second floor and had always been friendly in a neighborly way. "Margaret," she said, looking uncomfortable. "I need to tell you something. I probably shouldn't, but I think you should know." She glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then moved closer. "Yesterday, I was in the bank, and I overheard your daughter talking to someone on the phone. She was saying that you're having memory problems, that you've become suspicious and paranoid, and that she might need to get legal guardianship to protect you from making bad financial decisions." The words hit me like ice water. Legal guardianship. The ultimate violation, having my competence legally questioned, my rights legally stripped, my autonomy legally destroyed. I thanked Mrs. Chen for telling me, but inside I was reeling. This wasn't just financial manipulation anymore. This was an attempt to have me declared legally incapable of managing my own life. I called Patricia Chen immediately. "This is what I was afraid of," she said grimly. "When family members lose financial control over elderly relatives, they sometimes escalate to guardianship proceedings. It's the nuclear option. Can they do that? They can try. But you're not incompetent, Margaret. You're making rational decisions about your own money. Any competency evaluation would show that clearly." Still, the threat hung over me like a storm cloud. The daughter I'd raised, the woman I'd sacrificed everything for, was considering having me legally declared incompetent because I'd insisted on controlling my own finances. That evening, I sat in my apartment looking out at the city I'd called home for 7 decades, thinking about how much I'd changed and how much I still needed to change. The old Margaret would have called Sarah immediately, would have begged her not to pursue guardianship, would have offered to compromise, to share control, to do anything to prevent the legal battle. But the new Margaret understood something crucial: you can't negotiate with people who fundamentally don't respect you. You can't compromise with people who see you as an obstacle to their own desires rather than as a person with rights and dignity. I didn't call Sarah. I didn't plead or bargain or try to appease her. Instead, I documented everything, every conversation with Patricia, every meeting with Ruth, every decision I'd made about my finances. I created a paper trail that would show any judge that I was not only competent, but more in control of my life than I'd been in years. The guardianship petition never materialized. Whether Sarah reconsidered or whether her lawyer advised her she had no case, I never learned. But the threat of it taught me something important: there was no bottom to how far she was willing to go to maintain control over me and my money. That's when I finally understood that this wasn't fixable. This relationship, which I'd believed was the most important thing in my life, was actually built on a foundation of disrespect so deep that no amount of love or forgiveness could bridge it. 6 months had passed since I'd first discovered the deception about my money. Summer moved into fall, and then fall moved toward winter, but I was no longer afraid of the cold. I had heat in my apartment, food in my refrigerator, money in accounts that I controlled, and most importantly, I had the peace that comes from living authentically. Emma had become not just a neighbor, but a true friend. We went to movies together, explored different neighborhoods in the city, shared meals and conversations that felt natural rather than obligatory. She introduced me to her circle of friends, other women who worked in helping professions, who valued honesty and kindness over financial success and social status. Through Ruth's guidance, I had begun making charitable donations to organizations that helped seniors avoid financial exploitation. Not because I felt guilty about having money, but because I wanted to use my resources in ways that reflected my values rather than other people's expectations. I started taking painting classes at the senior center in my neighborhood. My hands, which had spent decades cleaning other people's messes, discovered they could create beauty instead. Watercolors became my meditation, my therapy, my way of expressing feelings I'd never learned how to speak aloud. One Thursday evening in November, as I was finishing a painting of the view from my window, Sarah called. I hadn't heard from her in 2 months, and her voice sounded small, different than it had during our previous conversations. "Mom, can we meet? I need to see you." Something in her tone made me agree. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in the village, neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage of home field. She arrived first and was sitting in a corner booth when I walked in. She looked thinner than I remembered, and there were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there in the spring. "Thank you for coming," she said as I sat down across from her. We ordered coffee, she had hers black, I added cream, and sat in silence for a moment, 2 women who shared everything and nothing. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said finally. I waited for her to continue. "She's been helping me understand some things about our relationship, about the way I've treated you." Her voice was quiet, uncertain. "I think I've been angry with you for a long time without realizing it." "Angry about what?" "About Dad leaving. About you always being tired and stressed when I was growing up. About having to be responsible for your happiness." She looked up from her coffee cup for the first time. "I know that doesn't make sense. You worked so hard for me. You sacrificed everything. But somehow I blamed you for not being enough to keep him around." The honesty was startling, painful, and somehow healing all at once. "So when you became successful and I was still struggling, it felt like justice. Like finally you needed me more than I needed you. And when you started asking for help with money." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I liked having you need me. I liked being the one with resources while you had to ask. My daughter had been punishing me for her father's abandonment. She'd been making me pay for not being a perfect single mother, for not being able to give her everything she'd wanted, for not being able to prevent the pain that had shaped both our lives. I'm not proud of that," she continued. "The therapist says it's called financial abuse, what we did. I kept telling myself it was good for you, but really it was good for us. It made us feel powerful and important." The admission felt like a gift I hadn't expected to receive. "I want to make it right, Mom. I don't know how, but I want to try." Making it right would take time, I told her. It would require her to accept that I was competent to manage my own life, that I had the right to make my own decisions even if she disagreed with them, that our relationship had to be built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. "I understand," she said. "I don't know if I can be the daughter you deserve, but I want to try to be better than I've been." It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. We didn't hug and cry and promise everything would be perfect. But it was a beginning, the first honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. Over the following months, we rebuilt our relationship slowly, carefully, with clear boundaries and honest communication. She came to my apartment for dinner once a month. We talked about her therapy, about my painting classes, about the city we both loved in different ways. She never asked about my money again. She never suggested that I needed her financial guidance or protection. When I mentioned charitable donations I was making or trips I was planning, she listened with interest rather than judgment. James Brookstone faded from our lives completely. Sarah left his company in the spring, taking a position with a smaller firm that specialized in ethical investment practices. She never explicitly said the change was connected to what had happened between us, but I suspected it was part of her effort to align her professional life with the person she was trying to become. Now, as I sit in my apartment on this December evening, watching snow fall outside my window and putting the finishing touches on a painting of Central Park in winter, I think about the woman I was a year ago and the woman I've become. The old Margaret lived in shadows, accepting crumbs of attention and calling them love, grateful for any scraps of respect thrown her way. She believed that sacrifice was the highest form of caring, that her worth was measured by what she could provide for others. The new Margaret understands that love without respect is empty, that sacrifice without acknowledgement becomes exploitation, that being needed is not the same as being valued. I've learned that it's possible to love someone and still refuse to be mistreated by them. That family doesn't give anyone license to manipulate or deceive. That my age and my past don't disqualify me from having standards and enforcing boundaries. My relationship with Sarah is different now, smaller in some ways, but more real. We see each other less often, but our conversations are honest. She asks my opinion instead of making assumptions about what's best for me. When we disagree, we discuss it like adults instead of falling into old patterns of manipulation and guilt. Emma continues to be a bright spot in my life, proof that it's possible to form new relationships based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and history. My money is mine to manage, spend, save, or give away as I choose. Ruth and I meet monthly to review my investments and discuss any changes I want to make. I've learned that being financially independent doesn't mean being selfish, it means having the freedom to be generous by choice rather than by coercion. The painting classes have evolved into something I never expected, a small group of women my age who meet weekly not just to paint, but to share stories, offer support, and celebrate each other's growth. We call ourselves the Renaissance Women, because we've all discovered that life can have second acts, third acts, and as many acts as we're brave enough to write. Last month, I took my first vacation in 20 years, a week in Santa Fe, where the light is different and the art galleries stay open late. I walked through mountains and painted desert landscapes and felt the kind of peace that comes from living authentically. I'm planning another trip for the spring, maybe to Tuscany or Scotland or somewhere else I've always wanted to see but never felt entitled to visit. My knee is strong. My bank account is healthy. My apartment is warm and comfortable. But most importantly, my soul is my own again. The city outside my window continues its eternal rhythm, taxis honking, sirens wailing, people rushing toward dreams and away from disappointments. But I'm no longer rushing anywhere. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I choose to do, living exactly the life I've decided to create. This isn't the life I imagined when I was raising Sarah in Queens, working nights and dreaming of a future where we'd be close and happy and grateful for each other. But it's a better life than I was living when I let other people's definitions of love and family trap me in relationships that diminished rather than elevated me. I've learned that there's a difference between being loved and being valued, between being needed and being respected, between being family and being cherished. As I clean my paintbrushes and prepare for bed, I think about tomorrow. I'll have breakfast with Emma, spend the afternoon at the senior center helping other women navigate financial questions, and come home to continue reading a novel I've been savoring like good wine. Simple pleasures, chosen freely, experienced fully. The woman who once begged for scraps of attention from people who saw her as an ATM has become a woman who receives genuine affection from people who see her as she truly is, intelligent, creative, resilient, and worthy of respect. That transformation didn't happen overnight. It required courage I didn't know I possessed, strength I had to cultivate, and boundaries I had to learn to enforce. But it was possible. Even at 73, even after decades of living as someone else's definition of who I should be, change was possible. The most surprising revelation has been discovering how much life I still have ahead of me. For years, I thought of myself as someone whose story was mostly over, whose role was to fade gracefully into the background while younger people lived their dreams and made their marks on the world. But I was wrong. My story is far from over. I'm writing new chapters every day, making choices based on my own desires rather than other people's expectations, creating a legacy that reflects my values rather than my fears. The money that was hidden from me has become a tool for creating the life I want rather than subsidizing relationships that cost me my dignity. The daughter who saw me as a resource to be managed has become a person I'm cautiously learning to trust again. The isolation that felt like punishment has become solitude that feels like freedom. I want to end by asking you something, dear friends who have listened to my story. Have you ever found yourself in a relationship where you were valued for what you could provide rather than who you were? Have you ever felt like you were living someone else's version of your life instead of creating your own? Have you ever discovered that people you trusted were making decisions about your life without your knowledge or consent? Have you ever felt like you had to choose between being alone and being disrespected? If any of this feels familiar, I want you to know that change is possible, no matter how old you are or how long you've been living according to other people's expectations. It's never too late to insist on respect, to enforce boundaries, to choose love that honors your worth rather than exploits your devotion. Tell me in the comments, have you lived something similar? Do you know someone who has? What gave you the courage to change, or what's holding you back from making changes you know you need to make? If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to possibilities you hadn't considered, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue sharing these intimate truths, and it helps these messages reach other people who might need to hear that they're not alone, that they're not asking for too much when they ask for respect, and that it's never too late to reclaim their power. Together, we can rewrite the narratives that have kept us small, challenge the definitions of love that have cost us our dignity, and create lives that reflect our worth rather than our wounds. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing me as I truly am. And thank you for having the courage to see yourselves clearly too. The snow is falling harder now, coating the city in clean white silence. Tomorrow will bring new possibilities, new choices, new opportunities to live authentically. I'm ready for all of it. As I prepare to turn off the lights and rest in my own space, in my own bed, with my own choices shaping my tomorrow, I feel something I haven't felt in decades: complete ownership of my life. Not the surface ownership that comes from paying rent or signing documents, but the deep, cellular ownership that comes from knowing your worth and refusing to negotiate it away. The phone rings sometimes, and I choose whether to answer. The calendar on my kitchen wall has appointments I made, activities I selected, commitments I want to keep. The money in my account serves goals I've set, dreams I've decided to pursue, causes I believe deserve support. When I wake up in the morning, the day ahead belongs to me in a way that feels revolutionary after so many years of living in the expectations and demands of others. I think about the women who have shared their stories with me at the senior center, women who've recognized themselves in my journey and found courage to examine their own lives. There's Mrs. Goldstein, who discovered that her son had been using her credit cards without permission. There's Maria Santos, whose family had convinced her she was too old to live alone while they slowly took control of her pension checks. Each story is different, but the pattern is the same: people who loved us, or claimed to, had decided that our autonomy was less important than their convenience, our dignity less valuable than their financial gain. The tragedy isn't just the money or the deception, it's the years we lost believing we were burdens when we were actually resources, believing we were dependent when we were actually self-sufficient, believing we needed protection when we actually needed respect. But the miracle is that these stories don't have to end with victimization. They can end with reclamation, with the revolutionary act of an elderly woman deciding that her life belongs to her, that her mind is still sharp enough to make choices, that her heart is still strong enough to demand authenticity. Yesterday, I helped a woman named Dorothy fill out paperwork to transfer her accounts away from the nephew who had been helping her manage them while keeping her in the dark about their growth. Watching her sign her name with a shaking but determined hand, I saw myself a year ago, scared but resolute, uncertain but unwilling to continue living a lie. The ripple effects of standing up for ourselves extend far beyond our individual lives. Every time one of us refuses to be diminished, we make it easier for the next woman to recognize her worth. Every time we enforce a boundary, we normalize the idea that respect is not negotiable at any age. I've started volunteering with the elder advocacy organization that Patricia connected me with. Once a week, I sit in their offices and listen to stories that sound heartbreakingly familiar: adult children who've gained access to accounts they never mention, financial advisors who make decisions without consultation, family members who use phrases like, "What's best for mom," while acting in their own interests. But I also see triumph. I see women in their 80s discovering they have the legal right to fire their power of attorney. I see men in their 90s learning that confusion about complex financial instruments doesn't equal incompetence. I see families learning to have honest conversations about money and autonomy and respect. The work fills me with purpose I hadn't expected to find at this stage of life. For decades, my value had been defined by what I could sacrifice for others. Now, it's defined by what I can teach others about refusing to sacrifice their dignity. Emma often joins me for these volunteer sessions, bringing her professional expertise as a social worker and her personal warmth as someone who witnessed my transformation. Together, we've developed workshops for families about healthy financial communication, about the difference between helping and controlling, about respecting the autonomy of aging relatives. You should write a book, Emma suggested recently as we walked home from one of these sessions. Your story could help so many people. The idea terrifies and exhilarates me in equal measure. For so long, I believed my story wasn't worth telling, that I was just an old woman who'd made mistakes, who'd been naive, who'd failed to protect herself from manipulation. But maybe that's exactly why it needs to be told. Maybe there are countless women sitting in apartments like mine, wondering why they feel so small in relationships that should make them feel cherished. Maybe there are daughters and sons who love their parents but have never learned the difference between helping and controlling. Maybe there are families who could avoid the pain mine experienced if they understood sooner that honesty is always kinder than deception, even when the truth feels complicated. Sarah and I have talked about this, about the book I might write, about the workshops I'm helping to develop, about the other families who might benefit from understanding our mistakes and our healing. I used to be embarrassed that people might find out what we did, she told me during one of our monthly dinners. Now I think I'd be proud if our story helped other families avoid the same mess. That's growth I never expected to see in her, the willingness to let our private shame serve a public good, to let our mistakes become lessons rather than just regrets. The relationship between us continues to evolve in ways that surprise me. Last month, she asked my opinion about a career decision she was considering. Not in the perfunctory way you ask someone you're obligated to consult, but in the genuine way you ask someone whose judgment you respect. She started dating someone new, a man who works for a nonprofit and drives a 10-year-old Honda and seems to value her thoughts more than her income. When she talks about him, her voice has a lightness it lacked when she was with men who saw her primarily as a successful professional rather than as a complete person. I think I'm learning what healthy relationships look like, she said recently. It's embarrassing that it took me this long, but better late than never. Better late than never. That phrase has become something of a motto for both of us. It's never too late to learn respect, to choose authenticity, to insist on relationships that honor rather than diminish us. The painting class has become one of the most important parts of my week. Not just because I'm learning to create beauty, though that matters more than I'd expected, but because I'm surrounded by women who are also writing new chapters of their lives. There's Helen, who started painting at 78 after her husband died and she realized she'd never developed interests that were purely her own. There's Grace, who left a decades-long friendship that had become toxic and is rediscovering what she actually enjoys when she's not managing someone else's drama. There's Betty, whose story is similar to mine, adult children who'd been managing her finances while keeping her ignorant of their growth, then acting wounded when she insisted on transparency. She's further along in her recovery than I am, and serves as proof that it's possible to rebuild trust without sacrificing self-respect. We paint everything, flowers and landscapes, portraits and abstracts, scenes from memory and visions of possibility. But what we're really doing is practicing the radical act of creating something purely because we want to, not because anyone asked us to or because it serves someone else's needs. My apartment has become a gallery of these paintings, reminders of afternoons spent in the simple pleasure of watching colors blend on paper, of conversations that meandered through decades of experience and wisdom, of laughter that had no agenda beyond the joy of being alive and autonomous. The walls that once displayed only photographs of other people's milestones now show landscapes I painted during my trip to Santa Fe, still lives I created from fruit Emma brought me, portraits I attempted of the women in my painting class who've become such an important part of my chosen family. Ruth continues to help me understand the complexities of wealth management, but more importantly, she's teaching me that financial literacy is a form of self-respect. Every monthly meeting, I understand a little more about how money works, how investments grow, how to make decisions that align with my values rather than just maximizing returns. We've structured my portfolio to include socially responsible investments, companies that treat their workers fairly, funds that support environmental sustainability, bonds that finance affordable housing projects. My money is now working in ways that reflect who I am rather than just generating profit for people who saw me as an unwitting resource. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now more financially sophisticated than I was when Sarah and James were protecting me from the complexity of my own investments. Turns out, I'm quite capable of understanding financial concepts when someone takes the time to explain them respectfully rather than assuming I'm too simple to grasp them. I've made donations to organizations I care about, the senior center where I volunteer, a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, a program that provides legal aid to elderly victims of financial abuse. Each donation is a choice I made consciously, a reflection of my values rather than an obligation imposed by someone else's expectation of my generosity. The freedom to be generous by choice rather than by manipulation feels revolutionary. When I write a check to support a cause I believe in, I'm not depleting resources I can't afford to lose, I'm investing in a world that reflects my values. The difference is profound and liberating. Winter has deepened outside my window, but my apartment stays warm now. Not just because I can afford the heating bills without anxiety, but because warmth comes from living authentically, from relationships built on mutual respect, from the knowledge that tomorrow belongs to me in ways I hadn't experienced in decades. Sometimes, late at night when the city grows as quiet as it ever gets, I think about the woman I was just over a year ago. She sits in this same kitchen, rationing soup and postponing surgery, believing herself to be a burden on people she loved. She's not a different person, she's me, trapped in a narrative that made her smaller than she actually was. I feel tender toward that woman, protective of her in ways I never was at the time. She deserved so much better than she was getting, but she didn't know how to ask for it. She confused being needed with being loved, mistook financial dependence for family closeness, accepted crumbs of attention because she'd forgotten what a full meal felt like. But she also had strength she didn't recognize. She'd raised a daughter alone, built a life from nothing, survived abandonment and poverty and decades of thankless work. She'd somehow accumulated wealth she didn't even know about, which speaks to an intelligence and capability that no one, least of all herself, had acknowledged. That woman was never as helpless as she felt. She just needed permission to protect herself, support to enforce boundaries, and witnesses to validate her worth. Once she had those things, the transformation was really just a return to who she'd always been underneath the layers of others' expectations. The process of reclaiming your life doesn't end with a dramatic confrontation or a sudden revelation. It's a daily practice of small choices, answering the phone when you want to, saying no to invitations that don't serve you, spending your money on things that bring you joy rather than things that bring others approval. It's looking in the mirror and seeing a person whose opinions matter, whose comfort is important, whose dreams deserve pursuit regardless of age or circumstance. It's recognizing that you've been living a smaller life than necessary and deciding to expand into the space you actually deserve to occupy. The snow continues to fall outside, each flake unique but part of a larger pattern that transforms the landscape. Change, I've learned, happens the same way, one small decision at a time, each choice seeming insignificant until suddenly you're living in a completely different world. Tomorrow I'll wake up in a bed I chose, in an apartment I can afford, with a day ahead that belongs to me. I'll make coffee in the cup I prefer, eat breakfast at the pace I enjoy, then spend my time in ways that reflect my interests and values rather than other people's expectations. These simple freedoms, taken for granted by people who've never lost them, feel like miracles when you've reclaimed them after years of living at the mercy of others' definitions of what your life should look like. I want to acknowledge something that might not be obvious from the way I've told this story. Reconciliation with Sarah, while healing, wasn't essential to my transformation. I would be complete, valuable, and worthy of respect even if she had never acknowledged her mistakes or changed her behavior. One of the most dangerous myths we tell ourselves is that we need other people's validation to be worth protecting. We wait for apologies that may never come, for recognition that may never arrive, for love that may never be offered on terms we can accept. But your worth doesn't depend on other people's ability to see it. Your right to respect doesn't wait for others' willingness to provide it. Your life doesn't begin when other people finally understand that you deserve better treatment. My story happened to include reconciliation, but that was a gift, not a requirement. I was already complete when Sarah called to apologize. I was already living fully when she expressed her desire to rebuild our relationship. Her growth added to my joy, but it wasn't necessary for my peace. If you're waiting for someone to acknowledge their mistreatment of you before you can begin to heal, please know that your healing can begin today, with or without their participation. Your life can expand, your joy can return, your dignity can be restored whether or not the people who diminish them ever admit their mistakes. Sometimes the most profound act of self-respect is continuing to live fully while others remain trapped in patterns that no longer serve anyone. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone who has hurt you is the example of what freedom looks like, lived quietly and consistently without waiting for their permission or participation. This is what I want to leave you with, the knowledge that your story doesn't end with other people's failures to see your worth. It doesn't end with betrayal or abandonment or the discovery that people you trusted were taking advantage of you. Your story continues with every choice you make to honor yourself, every boundary you enforce to protect your dignity, every decision to live according to your values rather than others' expectations. Your story continues with the radical act of believing you deserve respect, regardless of your age, your mistakes, your history, or your vulnerabilities. The city outside my window holds millions of stories, people struggling and growing, making mistakes and finding redemption, learning to see themselves clearly and love themselves fully. My story is just one among many, but it's mine to tell and yours to learn from if it serves you. Whether you're dealing with financial abuse or emotional manipulation, whether you're struggling with family dynamics or romantic relationships, whether you're young or old or somewhere in between, the principles remain the same. You have the right to be treated with respect, you have the power to enforce boundaries, and you have the permission to live according to your own values rather than others' expectations. It's never too early to start protecting your dignity, and it's never too late to reclaim it. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for seeing the worth in an elderly woman's journey toward self-respect. Thank you for believing that every life has value and every person deserves to be treated with dignity. The snow has stopped falling, and the city sparkles under streetlights that turn everything magical. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to live authentically, to choose respect, to write another page in the story of a life reclaimed. I'm ready for all of it. And I truly hope, that if my story has touched you, you're ready to write your own story of dignity reclaimed, boundaries enforced, and life lived on your own precious terms. You deserve nothing less.